Hello, everybody. My name is Pedro Castillo. I'm a psychoanalyst in Brazil. I work in person and online. And the lecture that I have prepared for you today it's about adolescence and contemporary time. To do that, I will share my presentation. Adolescence is a period of life that delimitates childhood and adulthood. And this term was invented for the first time with Jean Jacques Rousseau in his book Emilio. It was written by Rousseau and described a series of strategies to keep Emilio away from the exercise of sexuality until a solid moral formation is established. The word adolescence has an influence from the Indo-European to nourish, to grow, and to alere is increase, thus giving rise to the verb adolescence that is to grow. In the literature, we can also find this concept, and it has influenced the influence of Rousseau has influenced the German movement called Storm and Drag, and its movement was attempt to recover a building formation, bringing the context of that time a possibility to transmitting the tradition of ancient German culture to German youth. And then we have a displacement of this concept from literature to psychology. From this point of view, it is important to remember that characteristic of adolescence migrated to Stanley Hall's American development psychology. So the idea of development psychology that begins with childhood, adolescence, and then adulthood. So we have adolescence as a middle, as in the middle of this development movement. Freud always attempted to the issue that permeated the culture movement of the time, appropriated that concept to bring new contribution with psychology and psychoanalysis as its focus. The influence of Stanley Hall through Darwinian perspective, not only Stanley Hall, but also Freud was also influenced by the Darwinian concept. The 19th century and part of the 20th century were all influenced by this concept, and this concept was influenced by psychology when we see the idea of development. So, what we had during that time is a child would pass through adolescence and reach the adulthood, establishing the concept of responsibility and the adaptation in life. Um, Concept of adolescence in the field of development psychology is notable. The American psychologist and philosopher create a Darwinian construct of the issue of adolescent articulating in the field of psychology. Hall's work, Adolescence, made the author of the concept store and stress well known. Hall's fame made him invite Freud and Jung to Clark University, make him known as the person responsible for bringing psychoanalysis to the US. although later he is moved away from the approach of psychoanalysis because he disagreed with questions about sexuality. How influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and German philosopher Haeckel's theory of recapitalization, views adolescence as a period of puberty-induced growth that recapitulates the child's early development and influence of his behavior based on ancestral and genetic heritage. Therefore, Hall will be the first psychologist to the modern era to take into account the development and biological perspective. Freud and adolescence, Nachträglich. With psychoanalysis, we understand that Sigmund Freud never used the term adolescence. The only reference the concept of puberty. In the third essay of Theory of Psychoanalysis of Sexuality from 1909, Freud writes his third essay on the Gestalt der Pubertät, which can be translated as the metamorphosis of puberty. If Gestalt, a word inserted in the original title, translate a form, we can say that puberty calls upon adolescence to present itself as a new form with regard to drive dimensions. Freud references are the moment of latency of the drive that make the moment of manifestation of sexuality. For Freud, in the 1909 text, the autoerotic drive added to the Oedipal complex is subordinated to primary of genital ears, with, at the moment of puberty, a choice of sexual object and with that the exit from childhood. So we have an autoerotic moment that is part of childhood. Then we have a movement when the person reaches adolescence. We're going to have an election of object. So it's important to know that this part of life, it's the part of the person is going to choose what kind of the sexual desire he's going to have. And some people, it's sometimes it's difficult because they're passing for certain moments in their life that their self do not accept the moment of that the choices of the object that they have during adolescence. So some adolescents, they are going to get depressed because they have a certain moment that the self doesn't accept the election of object that the drive is passing through. And sometimes we also can see the social bonds that some adolescents passes through. For example, the social link that they pass it through. So we can see some adolescents that get together because they have a certain type of jouissance that connect each other, and some of them that are not connected to a certain type of jouissance, a certain type of pleasure that they pass through, they can get bullied or they can get depressed. And so it's important to know that this idea of sexuality comes in this time, and some of the work of the psychoanalyst is to help the adolescent to understand what he is passing through and how sexuality touches his behavior and how he is and also the idea of mourning, because during this time he's going to lose the body, he's going to lose his identification that they have with their parents, and he is going to connect, to have a different connection, not with the parents and the family anymore. He's going to have the connection with some adolescents that are passing through the same time he is passing. So, what kind of, instead of having a vertical identity with their parents, they are going to have more horizontal identity, identification. They are going to have an horizontal identification that we can see. They are more influenced by their colleagues and friends than their parents. And some of them, they reject the idea of law, and they have a certain difficult to connect with the rules of some institutions, the rules of the family, and sometimes they can have some delinquent behavior, and some of them they can begin to take drugs, for example. So all this connection, all this manifestation of the adolescence during those times is can be seen as something that they have some difficult to understand what they are passing through, how his body is now manifesting some difficulties that they are having, and also they fret the the law itself. Some of them they do that. It's very easy to see some of their behavior, but some of them they don't have those difficult, and they some of them they find the idea of studying hard, and the idea of having some weird behavior. Some the girls, for example, they spend some times in their room, and some boys they do too. They spend very long time in the video games, playing video games, and they scream, and like they are passing through a process that is very difficult to name what kind of a feeling they're having, and the psychoanalyst can help them to name it. If Freud For Freud, the task that adolescent has to fulfill at a time of puberty is the constitution of relationship with an object. With the arrival of puberty, chains are introduced that take child sexual life to its definitive normal configuration. Until that moment, the sexual drive was predominantly autoerotic, and now he finds the sexual object. The aspect to be carried on in the adolescence is the constitution of a sexual object. The sexual current starts to move away from the autoerotic current to choose an object of enjoyment. There are cases in which a sexual current remains autoerotic, leading the subject to satisfy himself with his own body. In the case of the primacy of genital drive, the relationship is faced with always of choosing the external object. For Freud, the adolescents must fulfill a relationship with different objects. So there are some enjoyments that does not go to someone's, does not go to an election of someone, let's say that. So most of Freud compared the transformation of puberty to the drilling of a tunnel that begins simultaneously at its end. The way in which Freud formulated this metaphor always allows us to understand that building the tunnel is the same as crossing it, that is finding a way of a symbolic elaborating the effect of its passage. For psychoanalysis, as at this moment in life, childhood drives fixations returns with overwhelming force, in which the past becomes present as a structure effect. An articulator to think of Freudian elaboration of puberty and adolescence is the feat of structure in the concept of Narteglish of heteroactivity elaboration. Although Freud never used the conception of structure in his studies, mainly because it precedes this moment, the conception of Narteglish has a similar importance. The value of this conception in Freud refers to the notion of reorganization on a transcription. The prefix "nash" in connection with certain verbs indicate returning to a past event to make an addiction. It also indicates that the subject constitutes to carry a certain event until the present moment as a return to the past. So something that was, let's say, that repressed during the autoerotic movement as a narcissistic, they will come to the present. So the past becomes the present, and the difficulty that some child had during his childhood will show again in a different version during the adolescence, a type of fixation. So what happened now in a different point of view is that we don't have a development moment, that a moment from childhood is surpassed through a second moment from adolescence. What we have is a structural movement that the past become the present. That's the idea of subject that Lacan has worked during his return to Freud. Another expression for this concept would be the term as posteriori, indicate that the subject has moved away from an event, and that only now, with the distance, does he reconsider the meaning of the event. Freud uses the concept of various points in his work, but it appears most frequent in the Dorian cases studying on history. Far from end development psychology, the idea that one stage would overcome another stage, childhood, adolescence, youth, adulthood, and old age, implies that understanding that the subject life story would surpass itself until reaching a different moment. Overtly, the notion of structure highlight the idea that affections and reactualization and involve the subject in the stage of their life. Gide by Lacan. From Lacan writes for the first time about adolescence and youth in an article published in the issue 131 of Revista Critique in April 1958, entitled Child's Youth on the Letter and the Desire. Lacan writes about a book by Jean Delay. Lacan writes about the work of Jean Delay, Youth of Gide, presenting the psychiatrist's reading of adolescence. For Lacan, Delay recognized in Gide a homo literatus, mainly in the work If the Grand Does Not Die, psychography, Gide show, and his soliloquy are heard in his work. The scene with Gide that says he will fall in love with her cousin, the relationship between the mother and Gide, and the marriage with the cousin without intimate relations. Thus, Gide himself established a link between the first butts of childhood anguish and literary enthusiasm. Both are emotional intoxications, fears, and joy, with more or less no apparent object, which are similar in certain aspect and different in order. To designate this stage, he used the term Schedern, meaning shake in German, which he discovered by reading Schopenhauer. It should also be noted that Gide gives these anxiety attacks a positive content. During his childhood and adolescence, he had major bout on angst that they managed to overcome. The first occasion who was when he learned on his cousin's death. When he realized that his cousin is dead, a notion of sadness floods him. What made him cry was not the death, but an indefinable anguish. Later, reading Schopenhauer, he named his feeling Schaden. The second is even stranger to him, occurring shortly after his father's death. At 11 years old, he was only with his mother. Suddenly, he broke down, falling into his arm, crying, convulsing, feeling that inexpressible angst again, indicate that he was less sad than scared. Desperate, he tells his mother, I'm not like the others. I'm not like the others. This third occurs in adolescence. His mother had warned him about the dangers of a hallway full of prostitutes, where a classmate who returns from school, suggesting they warn him. When Andrea does so, he is suddenly invited by something huge, religious, panicked, like when his little cousin died, or when his first separated excluded him, he felt crazy. Like an adolescence life intimidates art. Lacan opens the way for us to think about adolescence based on the notion of structure. What could be symbolized depends on an effect, a posterior that is found in the passage of adolescence. Puberty and adolescence for Lacan have a logical, not chronological implication that produced a possibility of reinsuring the subject in a historical dimension. So we have present, past, and present. Therefore, we can see that as a circle. Lacan, based on a beautiful analysis of the work of German playwright and journalist Frank Wedekind, The Awakening of Spring, a play written in 1891, opens up the possibility for us to think about his hypothesis. It is a work divided into three acts, with protagonists as three teenagers aged 14 to 15, the girl Vedla and two boys, Norris and Marcius. Their work is a great reference to understanding the problems and dramas of adolescence. The encounter with sexuality and its consequence, the absence of parents, and a young woman who has an abortion, a young man who commits suicide, and a young man who lives a long period of wandering, and that is too good encounter managed to make a healthy transition to the theme that run through the plot of the work. Although Freud commented on this work in the Wednesday meeting, it was Lacan who wrote a text about Wedekind's work in 1974, preface to the Awakening of the Spring. Each character in the work will have a different destiny. Melchior allows himself to be shadowed by masked men and escapes the kings of death. Marish and Wedler are unable to carry out this arduous task and end up being taken down the death path. The playwright submitly illustrated the conflict of adolescence. Wedler, thus don't kiss me, Melchior. People love each other when they kiss. No, 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 Melchior, believe me, in love. Everything is interesting, everything is selfness. I love you as little as you love me. In the work in this work, each teenager responds to the question of sexuality with a different dream. Vera defines with a friend and a dream that she is beggar, putting herself in the position of rest. Melchior tells of a dream in which he whipped the dog without letting it move. The other character, Moritz, dream of a woman leg and in overcome his moral anguish according to himself. It seemed that me and eternal evil was consuming me, but then I calmed down as I started writing about my life. At the end of the work, that character of masked man mentioned by Lacan as one of the father's name appears assuring a possible way to introduce Melchior to desire. At this point, it is important to demarcate that each character, from the moment that is an encounter with a sexual, produce an effect of structure, enlightening Lacan's idea that the sexual makes a whole in the sexuality. The idea of whole in this context refers to something that is not symbolized to produce the symptom that we find in a character in Windekind's work. Each subject faced with encounter with a sexual is called upon to give new meaning, producing a new meaning. On two occasions, 74, 75, Lacan qualified the name of the Father as the name of the name of the name. The first time was in the preface of The Awakening. But the name has so many names that there is no one that suits him except the name of the name of the name. No name that is your proper name. Order the name as an existence. This concept of the name of the name of the name, one in the context of a tragic approach to the name of the Father, another is that on a scientific approach, both refers to the notion of existence. According to Lacan, the expression masked man points not bad to the existence of the name of the Father. In Windekind's play, the masked man intervenes at the end as a kind of Deus ex machina to save a young man from death. The role was played by Wedekind himself on the occasion of the first performance of his plays in Berlin. Nothing is known about the character since she is reduced to her mask. The character, if that term can be used, plays a supplementary role to Wedekind himself, who dedicates that play to him, not the masked man, the actor. To the masked man, the actor. The name of the masked man exists in relation to the fiction. It gives him a proper name, but does not contain him in its entirety. The masked man has his place, his role in fiction, does not case to exist outside of it, but also not without it. Fiction establishes a proper name to which Wedekind can unite, dedicate an existence that results the pure semblance. The existence of a masked man, of the name of the Father for Wedekind, depends on the fiction that name him, which produce a version of him without thereby abolish his existence. The new Latin term Deus ex machina is a translation of Greek phrase and means literally a good from a machine, a god from a machine. Machine in the case refers to the crane that held a good overstate in ancient Greek and Roman drama. The practice of introducing a god at the end of the play to unravel and resolve the plot dates from the age of 5th century And before Christ, Euripides was of the plane who made then frequent use of the device. The effect produced a new way of thinking about Nachträgische effects. Sometimes from the past is not present in the translation from the erotic drive to the drive with an object. There is a residue that resists being produced by Nachträgische effect, causing disorder that affect the adolescent subject body in direct and difficult to symbolize mirrors. So we have erotic drive and the drive with object, but it means that we don't have a displacement that goes totally to the drive with object. We have a rest that install in their body. So those type of manifestations that we have in some adolescents' behavior during contemporary time is that most of the adolescents they try to name this rest of jouissance that is in their body with some tattoos, with piercing, with an erratic behavior. It's difficult then to connect with the other, and it is we have those type of diagnostic in the classic psychiatry and the DSM as t uh, as the hyperactive behavior. um, Preface of the spring and awaken to realize that this is a relationship of meaning of jouissance, that the jouissance is phallic, it is the experience that accounts to this. The case of a teenager who started that he likes blonde woman means a phallic enjoyment. The meaning of the meaning is that I like it the boys' enjoyment as a prohibit. This is certainly not to prohibit the so-called sexual relationship, but to crystallize it into a known relationship that is valid for in reality. The meaning of meaning is that is a link to the boy's enjoyment and prohibit certainly not so a prohibit of sexual relationship, but to fix it in the non-relation, it is equivalent to in the real. So now I will show a case that is not that help us to understand some of those things that we're talking about. The 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 Gaps case and the question of naming beyond phallic enjoyment. Gabriel is a young 16 years old diabetic who comes at the office saying he has a depression and is unable to complete his task. He studies at school and works in a carpentry shop and often arrives late for the session, shifts from night to day. He is quite complaining and not very pragmatic in solving his problem. He has little enthusiasm for life. He says he is abandoned with little desire to live. He was born and raised in a traditional neighborhood in the city that is changing a lot due to the gentrification. His sex life is quite intense. His reports and interesting in different types of women, thin, fat, black, white, short, and tall. During treatment, he reports great difficulty controlling his diabetes. I eat hamburgers, soda, sweets quite often, he says. Gabriel lived with a carrier for his maternal grandmother and had a very close and admirable relationship with her. But at the same time, he had a very difficult relationship with an uncle who still lives in the house of his grandmother. His uncle always questioned the fact that Gabriel lives in a house, saying that he had no right to be there. After some time, he started dating an Italian woman, but she started demanding a more active position in life. from him. He couldn't stand the relationship and ended up ending the relationship. At another point, he used a battery story to understand his position in life. One day, when the narrator asked Batterby to reveal a document, the young man simply responded, "I'd better not to." The pandemic arrived. We start to provide care remotely. He continued with the care and is always in a very relaxed position, shirtless, lying in bed. During the pandemic, he has a romantic encounter with a woman he made a dating app. The woman is black and he has a very committed identity discuss. Gabriel identifies with the discuss and begins to talk about his sexuality. He began to say that he is bisexual and only have a relationship with women. He started wearing women's clothes, dyeing his hair and nails, and starting dating these women. After his grandmother's death, he began to give together. Gabriel began to say that he prefers to be called Gabs. At that same time, Gabs tattooed his name on his chest and says he feels more comfortable with his neutral name. The analyst interpreted this name as a naming related to say and to become the name. In the Atourdi, Lacan takes up the proportion interpretation focuses on the cause of desire and adds the cause that reveals and this through the demand, which develops the set with the model of saying. To elucidate this statement by Lacan, it is necessary to interrogate the relationship between saying and what is said. Lacan clarifies that what is said does not go without saying. That is, there is no saying without saying. By accepting the name Gabs, the analyst recognizes the naming as a saying of the subject's enjoyment. The saying is always implies the what is said, but the saying, the forgotten behavior, what is said. Therefore, the analyst must make a distinction between what is said, the statement, and what the saying, the enunciation of the analyzer. This says the naming of enjoyment of the subject that parasitizes his body, the fantasy which is linked to the proper name as the function of protecting the structure defected from being constituted on the field of speech by proposing as an imaginary screen to the role. In the linkage to the subject's name to color, but in the adolescence, when fantasy falters and the discovered structure gap, emerge the name that ensures some identity to the bankrupt subject resonate in the void. The proper name is to be regained to give address to your work in the field of saying. He must regain a place of adoption from which he will be named. This place is the place of speech from which he will be able to recognize himself as affiliated. Adolescents bring the question of thinking of a name on a name that counts among the names of the order. This requires that the subject agree to link his identity to the recognition of the order as his work. His own name is the center of identity question. How we can maintain this identity is based only on appearance. I signify that fails to say that his adolescence is therefore a time where the subject will try to impose a meaning, a name that would inscribe him into an identity, name of a name of a name, a name that is your proper name. The forces modes are multiple and individual. Same adolescence mark the everywhere on every possible surface, city, walls, corners, overpass, in the subway, on buses, in schools, the bathroom, and school desks, and also mainly on a skin. The proper name can be a signifier. It says that the subject in which is an effect of language that translates what lacks, that the subject fundamentally lacks in identity. Therefore, it is correlated with real as long as included the impossible to say. The proper name is therefore the one that links a real of a jouissance to semblant of the signifier. The construction of a body uh, and name is described from contingence from an encounter between the signifier and the jouissance. As Millet teaching his Lacanian orientation course in the class of March 25 from the act of tattooing the name in a contingence category, we establish another law that commands the repetition by which each subject is captured. This is why Lacan moves at the end of his teaching from symbolic to contingence. This is why we must think of the act of a naming and tattoo from the subjects in contemporary times as bodily event that established from an effect of contingence. This question about body taken up another moment of theorization, another place, with another use of mathemes are found in the title of Encore Simulant, in which Lacan plays a homophonic game in the construction of encore. A phrase appears from the beginning that enjoyment of a body of the order with symbolized is not a sign of love. It's not simply a question of articulating a distinction between enjoyment and love, but of delimiting a space, a narrow limit in which one sex narrow to the other sex. It is about using topology based on a contingent effect, bringing about opaque enjoyment of one by one from act of tattooing and naming oneself. What would it mean to consider the consistency of the body through contingence? We can consider the consistency of a body through the real as an effect of contingence manifests itself as what which in body is lawless, including in a new arrangement based on invention of a work arrow. This arrangement implies a reconsideration of imaginary, whose function we find articulated to the real by contingence. By how can we find this real? The register of real is not unequivocal in Lacan. It does not admit a single definition. This is a real that of impossibility, another dimension of a real, of written impossibility of sexual relation, which manifests itself as a non-relation. And so, to work with some adolescents during contemporary time, we have to see that it's very difficult for some adolescents to choose the object of jouissance, the object of pleasure, away from them, to choose that in some person or something. Like we can talk about something in a different perspective, as if the person has chosen to be a pervert, but mostly speaking is with some person. That's how we can think about love. But for some adolescents, the jouissance, there is a rest that is connected to the other. So when the person does not find a phallic jouissance, and there is a rest that is not connected to the other, that there is a rest that goes in their body, we see some manifestations of that in their behavior, in their erratic behavior, in their tattooing, in their person. And some of them, we can see their behavior with their difficult to name the non-existence of sexual relationship. In the case of Gabs, we see that he had to name a way to name how is his pleasure and how his jouissance, to name the non-existence of the sexual relationships. Okay, thanks a lot. I'm wait for the next presentation.